Oh,
Okay, here we are. Idle talk.
is Chase really here or is he just pretending to be here?
I don't know.
I am
Oh,
fully here. However, my internet is not working, so I'm just using my phone.
That's probably an AI, is my guess.
Probably is.
well, we can do the Turing test.
Let's
If
go
we,
for it. Yeah, the
oh
voice
yeah,
comp
if we
test.
if we
I'll
can't
fail the voice
determine,
comp test.
well, but Chase, if well, I'm calling you Chase. I'm calling you. Can I? The original Chase is Chase one, and until you prove otherwise, we're going to call you Chase two, until you can convince us that you're not a bot, you're not AI, you're actually Chase.
Here, I have a
Plato,
question that should probably settle it. Chase, what do you think about Plato?
Plato sucks.
There you go.
Okay,
Thanks,
yeah.
Chase.
Wait, one more. Chase, you see a tortoise on its back and you're not helping.
Ah, a hot day.
On a hot day.
I see a tortoise on back. What do you mean? My mother.
Well, I thought you were going with someplace else, Joseph. It says the old saying was if you see a turtle on the top of a fence post, you know it didn't get there by itself.
He was referring to the test for replicates in
Blade Runner.
Blade Runner. Yeah,
Uh,
that was there was a series of questions that determined whether someone was a replicant or a human, which had to do with their emotional response to certain questions, like you see a dying turtle, or you see this or that. So anyway, everyday being. Um, I don't know. This probably isn't a great question, but one thing I'm wondering is what I don't have a sense of I don't know what the opposite of idle talk is. Authentic talk. I I'm not sure I even understand what that would be like. What would it be like for to have a conversation that was not idle talk?
I,
Or I mean, I think this is right. It's like most of these so-called authentic modes of whatever seem to be actually just modifications of these sucky modes. And so, like I'm guessing that whatever authentic speech would be or whatever would be um have to be a modification of idle talk, I guess. I'm not sure. So that's one question. And then another question I've got is I don't know because he says that the problem with idle talk is that or a problem is that it does not actually, I've forgotten how he put it, but does not actually disclose primordial structures of being, that kind of thing, which presumably whatever the opposite is would, but I don't know what that would be like. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of took it as like, and it's hard for me because like, hi, I'm ADHD as heck. I will randomly get distracted by something and talk about it. So like everything is interesting, particularly to me, but it's like, but for us, on the neurodivergent spectrum, it's relevant. So I think for me, like what he refers to is how like this it's the type of speech where like everything is just like, let's talk about anything and everything we can see, but there's no relevance as to why that person is talking about it. So it just becomes this way to, what's the word I'm looking for? Inoculate yourself with everything that you can without making it relevant to your own expression.
I, so in your version, Joseph, you're saying that that idle. Are you saying idle talk would have that kind of innocuous effect, or
He seems to
um,
hint that it does, like it's a way to just like make just everything that you can possibly pull from your current observation or what you're talking about, just to not have silence, to not actually do any type of relevant self-reflection or even
Yeah.
mention why that's important to you or why you're talking about it. It's just, boy, I like broccoli. Broccoli is the best. Broccoli with cheese is even better. But you know what's even better than that? I don't know, racing. Racing's really great and racing's fun. And I like car. It's just anything that like is not really relevant to the conversation or that you can tie a meaning in language to, but you're just filling the void, so to speak, so you don't have to have any type of relevance or self-reflection.
Yeah, I don't know what the intention is, and I actually had that as a question, like what is the intention behind idle talk? But I think that that's a good idea. I wanted to say in response to your question, Nevitt, I feel like you already answered it because I feel like my noticing followed the same trend where I noticed first that Heidegger describes idle talk as not disclosing, as closing off being, and so from which I inferred that whatever non-idle talk is, it doesn't seem to give a term for it, but maybe he's thinking of discourse like that. I don't know, but whatever it is, that would be whatever opens up being and discloses being, I assume, even though I don't know what that means.
Yeah, I don't know what that means either. And like the stuff that Joey and Chase are talking about, like reticence, saying little, those are all negative. They're like saying what it's not. Like I mean they sound positive, but not saying a little is saying what it's not, right?
I might add that like I'm thinking of I think Heidegger mentions it at some point where he says like this is like resistance to dwelling somewhere. And I think the same question of just like what would we mean by dwelling? And I think I saw him pointing a lot at just like how idle talk again like assumes everything is already understood. And so it's like it doesn't actually want to spend time talking about something and being confused or perplexed or like trying to grasp and understand something because it's kind of just like, oh, it's already understood. Like we're going to talk about it, and talking about it is as if the equivalent of like grasping it and understanding it. And I mean, like I think Heidegger uses the phrases even like action at some point. Like he says, like idle talk is not about action. It's like just talking about the things might as well be the equivalent of having done them because like the they is just it's almost like it's already accomplished it and being able to kind of talk about it. Like it's just in repeating in repeating the hearsays, like that is the action that it wants to participate in, as opposed to this feels vague, but like engaging in an action. When I say action too, I'm tying it to Heidegger's more maybe like ready to hand understanding of understanding. Sorry, mixed understandings there. But I think when Heidegger uses understanding, it's a little bit more like tied to like practical engagement and involvements. And I think like discourse and language and saying little, I think it plugs into being in the world in an involved, concerned, caring way, as opposed to kind of just like the maybe more like explicit, conscious, like I'm talking about concepts and this is me like creating change in my life or the world, or like making actions happen by grasping something very like heady and conceptually. And maybe I'm making like a leap there. I'm just kind of maybe stumbling upon that like as I talk. But this element of like, I think maybe he wants to say, or maybe this is a question that I'm arriving at of like, would idle talk be, would any kind of like conceptual conversation be idle talk? Because I think there was a part of me that wants to read like we can slow down a conversation and dwell in trying to like understand something and be confused by it. But I think I'm still like kind of coming back around to like how do we bring it back to Heidegger's concept of understanding, to like being in the world in this like actionable way, as opposed to just kind of this like conscious, I know things. I know a thing. I think he would say like that's maybe not understanding. It's maybe too like devoid from being in the world.
It's really
Um,
interesting you say that because I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. You can go.
As soon as you said that, I was thinking like, since we're being recorded, I won't go into details, but like before this started, Joey and I were together here hanging out and we were talking and the language was more of interpersonal connection. And then I was thinking about the language that I have on an everyday basis with people like I work out with or go to see it at the office. It's like, how are you? I'm okay. How was your weekend? My weekend was great, but nobody ever has like a conversation where it's a meaningful connection. Like the language there is not one that forms concepts where we're trying to understand each other's design. And maybe that's more what he means by idle talk, because it's interesting that Joey said presence at hand, because I thought there was design, objects at hand, and presence at hand. And with presence at hand, that's where like tools and language and psyche come in, and we start creating these projects with presence at hand for him. But when we have idle talk, we're really not forming or creating projects or concepts or connecting to each other. We're just kind of obfuscating to avoid that.
well, if I could uh, build on what you and Joey said, I remember saying to there was a book. It was a work of fiction, and there were two characters, and the one said to the other, and they'd known each other for quite some time, saying, "How many real conversations in depth have you actually had with people where you were actually expressing yourselves on foundational issues about, I'm not doing justice to it, but faith, reality, your place in the universe, ethics, morals, and that, and they were being honest and said, well, maybe 10 times. And so, I think sometimes when people talk to each other, it's almost like a social lubricant. It's, think about the United States today. Well, you can't talk about politics and you can't talk about religion. And after a while, it's platitudes. It's, oh, let's talk about the weather, or what about a sports team, the NCAA, college basketball tournament. And people start talking about events, and maybe even, think of gossip, which can be very mean spirited. But even if it's more neutral, are you talking about people? You're talking about events. You're talking about ideas. And so for me, when he was talking about empty talk, or is that, maybe that's not the phrase he used, but to me it was, literally conversations that, well, words that literally were not trying to express one's understanding of very important foundational issues.
Yeah. Well, and then so like towards the end of Heidegger 167, under like the idle talk part where he's starting that, the first sentence he says the expression idle talk is not to be used here in a disparaging sense. Terminologically, it means a positive phenomenon which constitutes the mode of being of the understanding and interpretation of everyday Dasein. And so, like, from that part, I'm curious what you all thought about that. It seemed to me like he was also trying to say, like, I'm not even putting down idle talk or whatever. It's like, and it seems like I get the sense that it's tied in with this conception of the they, and the fact that like we're just like in the world, and the they is like a part of our self or whatever, in such a way that like you can't get out of it. Like we're going to have idle chatter. I mean, specifically since he says, I'm not using it in a disparaging sense, it seems like he's not necessarily against it. But and then tied with that, I mean, I'm just like with everyone else, trying to get a sense of what he means. I get the sense, and I'm curious if y'all agree or disagree with this, that it's like maybe it's something like when you're talking to people, because we're engaged in our everyday, you know, being, or with Dasein, we're like uprooted. He keeps saying this uprooted thing. We're like, to me, there's almost like a Kierkegaardian thing here of like we're not in touch with like the ontological dimension that he's trying to get at. So anything you say, even if it's politics or something like that, is going to be, you know, uh, like adrift in kind of just this like realm of the ontic, like these things that have no anchoring in the deeper ontological or existential dimension or something.
Yeah, I was wondering about that too. I mean, for me, I don't know if this is me like wanting it to not be that way, but I did not read it as being topic dependent, like what idle talk is, right? Like idle talk is denominated as things like talking about the weather, chit chat about like how your weekend was, right? All those things that people typically talk about as being like kind of bullshit filler. Like I don't know that those things are by virtue of their subject idle talk so much as it's the teleology, of the conversation. It's like when you have that kind of talk, you're not actually trying to communicate anything to the other person so that they understand something, right? It's more about the filling the space, as other people here have said. And I kind of I wonder if that's the larger criteria of idle talk, that its end is not to disclose being, but it is to talk for the sake of talk. Just like how curiosity he describes as it's seeing for the sake of seeing, right? It's not, there's no other end in it.
So here's one point of confusion. I wrote a question in the chat, and Chase wrote something that may be a response, but so well, I don't know if he would call authentic speech or what, but whatever kind of communication, I mean, I don't know what to call it, but anyway, authentic speech or something, whatever kind of communication is not idle talk. If it's supposed to disclose being that are an aspect of understanding, my sense of that, that understanding is about this engagement with these ready to hand beings that, like the way that things themselves disclose themselves, if I'm understanding them right, is in this mode of engagement with being in the world, which is not primarily a conceptual mode. It's the mode where they're just sort of, sort of an extension of what I am and what I'm doing and how I'm involved in the world. But then I don't know how you speak about those beings without turning them into present at hand beings, because, as like, to use his common analogy, or not analogy, but a situation of being in some kind of wood shop or something where you're using hammers and tools. If I'm using a hammer in the mode of ready to hand, I'm not thinking about it as a hammer. I'm not thinking the concept hammer. I'm not speaking the word hammer. This hammer is something I am using in this process. And yet, in order to talk about it, it seems like I would have to say hammer. And as soon as I do that, have I not turned it into a conceptual idea and then sort of turned it into a present at hand being? So I don't know I don't know what mode of communication discloses this primordial being that he talks about without reducing those entities to present at hand things.
Well,
I'm
can I
recalling a quick comment. I'm recalling he mentions, like, I think it was in this last section where he says, like, it's not the hammer. Like, when I'm speaking of the hammer in this like ready to handed way, I don't even say the hammer. I might just say, like, this doesn't work, give me something different. This is too heavy, I need something lighter. And I'm thinking, like, those are like maybe very like simple examples, but I'm wondering what it would look like on a, you know, a more complex level to be speaking of things in a way that doesn't necessarily like just turn them into kind of like present to hand things. And another part of me is wondering if we're if I don't know if that necessarily is what makes the difference between like idle talk and I don't know what to call the other one, if we want to call it reticence or just authentic language. But
Can I just say that the fact that, first off, to preface this, the fact that that question makes sense to me, Nevitt, scares me at a fundamental level. So I'm just going to throw that out there. I'm a little concerned. However, um, to build on what you and Joey are saying, is this where he kind of draws in the aspect of psyche when it comes to how language relates to certain projects, so that when we do talk about them, particularly the hammer, it's still in presence at hand because it's part of a project, but there are certain psyches associated with projects that may put them in variant levels of what we interact with.
I'm not sure. What do you mean by psyches there?
Have we gotten there, Chase? I don't know if I've read it too far or if this is even relevant to the discussion.
Heidegger generally hates everything psychological. So he's never, I think the only time he uses the word psyche, at least in in translation, obviously, it's usually in a way to contrast that with his ontological existential things that he's pointing out. Because he wants to, this is pretty common in philosophy since, at least Kant, that they want to distance themselves from a empirical psychology, which would be a kind of, that's more what Heidegger would consider something like a present at hand depiction or description of what's going on in your mind, something like that. And he wants to do something quite different from that.
Yeah, I was thinking less psychology or from the concepts of psychology, but when he used the Greek word psych for certain objects or certain projects had a psych to them, not psychology in the sense, but like the maybe I'm
I don't. Yeah, suke word that means soul.
oh yeah, like the to use uh, to use that, there's certain aspects of like psych or suke associated with projects that, even though they're in the realm of presence at hand, that language can form concepts around them, but it's not psychology.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess that would probably be two different ways of thinking about the word psyche, at least in terms of, yeah, there's, the kind of psychology that, well, that's really a good example of idle speech in a lot of ways. This would be the way okay, one way of thinking of idle talk, at least the way that I think of it, a good test of it is it's something that, oh, everybody knows what that means. So if you talk about something in a way where your grandma or your neighbor Bill down the street could understand, that's a good example of kind of the average intelligibility that is idle talk. So I think that, I mean, so Heidegger is giving a concept of that. So it's a philosophical concept about something that isn't itself a philosophical concept. So I think we can talk about those things without them actually, you can talk about idle talk without it being idle talk. And I think that's what, okay, so I haven't read this in the actual book necessarily, But what I was thinking, and I put this in the chat, is the way that phenomenology is described, way back in the beginning. It sounds like that would be the opposite of idle talk, and that so idle talk, it it doesn't disclose the primordial being, the relationships of being of the entities that it talks about. Well, what does? That's phenomenology. That's exactly the way he describes phenomenology. So I think that would be a good example. Although at the same time, it'd be kind of ridiculous to think that what only phenomenology, the thing you're doing, is authentic speech. So I think it's really more than that. And I think also, I think poetic speech, the way that he describes that, is also something that would disclose the being of what is talked about. But then at the same time, the thing that it is structure, it's formal structure, what is going to take the place of. So idle talk is inauthentic discourse, which is an existential of Dasein. And then the authentic version of discourse is the call of conscience, which is something that we just haven't gotten to yet. Because he's going through the inauthentic modes of these things before the authentic. So he's done the kind of formal structure so far. He's given us, being in the world, being with others, being oneself. He's got the formal parts out of the way, and now he's giving us the inauthentic everydayness, the mode of everydayness of those structures. Then he'll give us the authentic version, and then he'll also give us this the same thing extrapolated through temporality. So isn't that fun? Aren't y'all looking forward to that? Yep.
Sorry,
I wanted
Chase,
to,
what did? Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to echo one thing that Chase had said. I was listening to a podcast about a person talking about Simone de Beauvoir and like the way that she was describing phenomenology. It's somewhere in her books, but her saying that like phenomenology is about a denaturing and getting back to like the strangeness of something. And when I think of that like phenomenology quote of just like back to the things themselves, but this element of like stepping back out of this almost this attitude of like it's only natural that slash like everyone knows, like it's just this kind of like assumption of already understanding something. Everybody already knows, it's only natural that. And this element of phenomenology as denaturing and getting back to the word they were using was strangeness. And I'm feeling like getting back into like the strangeness of looking at something and recognizing like there's something we could understand more about it. Seems significant to me to like dwell into that without just checking it
Yeah.
off.
So I think that's definitely a good way to describe strangeness, and the way that, so in the next reading he'll talk about anxiety and the uncanny, that's strangeness, and that comes from this kind of disruption or a withdrawal of the everyday mode of significance and whatnot. So this will be something that presents the first disruption within the continuity of the inauthentic absorption and fallenness of being in the world. And it's done in terms of the uncanny, the strange. I think that's a really good example. And that's also kind of what my always incomplete thesis is supposed to be somewhat about. So is that okay? So Uh, Joe, is that a quote from uh, Simone de Beauvoir, or was that just the podcaster? Because I would like to. It was from Simone de Beauvoir, then I would definitely like to quote that.
Yeah, I do not know, but I can share the podcast with you if you want to go explore and see if I don't recall if it was like straight from Simone or if that was their word.
Yeah, just give me the podcast and I'll go through it.
What did you, sorry,
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Jane.
what did you say Heidegger calls authentic speech? Chase, I didn't hear you.
Um, the Hall of Conscience. Yep. So I mean, that may be a little too simplified in that it's something more. So it's a form of speech that I think more makes you receptive to. Um, it's connected with a bunch of other concepts. So the call of conscience would be. It's not actually language. So I was just reading some of this section. I don't want to get too much into it just because, I mean, first of all, it's complex. We just haven't read this section. But uh, so the call of conscience kind of brings forward, it reveals Dasein's own authentic possibilities of being, but that is connected with this idea of being guilty and then reticence. And I think really it's reticence that is the actual discourse. But even then, he makes the point that uh, this voice connected with conscience and being guilty, and as the name implies, reticence. It doesn't include any actual language or any kind of actual voice. So yeah, but I think that's another reason why it's probably difficult to figure out. But I don't think it's authentic speech would necessarily be simply tied to that, which would mean that, in terms of spoken language or whatnot, you wouldn't be able to have any kind of authentic version of that, which I don't think that's the case. So I may be wrong about all this.
Well, one thing I keep coming back to and keep hammering on is that, and I'm not sure about idle talk, but that a lot of these things that are again, he's doing ontology, and so they're modes of being, and though even though they sound like there's something else, like I think like discourse, for example, is not merely speaking. It's discourse is a means by which understanding finds expression, but that is not necessarily equivalent to speaking about something. And so I'm not sure. I mean, something makes me think that idle talk is like that as well, that we read this week, but that idle talk, I mean, kind of like, I mean, I was getting this from something Chase said, triggered this, that idle talk is not merely about a mode of speaking, but it's a way that we exist in the world, in this mode of being with others, but in this kind of superficial skimming across the surface of things. So certainly I would think it is modes of speech are an aspect of that, but I don't think it's limited to just ways of speaking. I think it's ways of being, ways of interacting, ways of operating in the world.
Yeah, I had a question about that. He actually says at in Heidegger 168, um, this is like at the top of the section that we read, and I thought this was kind of funny. He says, for the most part, discourse is expressed by being spoken out and has always been so expressed. It is language. And last time we seemed to arrive at the conclusion that discourse is not speech. And I think that that was reasonable based off of what we read. But then he comes out here and is like, for the most part, discourse is speech. I don't know. So I don't really know what to make of it. And
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
what's interesting too, is that for example, on 163, where this is the Stambaugh edition, 163, 123 paragraph down, at the end, where he says, for what is said is initially always understood as telling, which could be discourse, that is, it is discovering. Thus, by its very nature, idle talk is a closing off, since it omits going back to the foundation of what is being talked about. And I have in my notes here about idle talk is that when I interact with a lot of idle talk, um, it it creates a yearning to have genuine conversation. Like when I have too much idle talk, I crave these seminars. I want to go in it, but this yearning for genuine conversation, authentic self, what it's emitting is interesting to me, because it leads up into the next section, because it's like it's what it's not talking about, or what it's admitting, creates the desire for genuine conversation, which is a fascinating concept. Like why does it do that? And I think Heidegger is asking, why does it do that? What are we striving for then? And what is it, can it possibly lead us to a framework of Dasein? Because when we have this idle talk, it creates a yearning. And what is that part of this, framework of what he's trying to build in his project, of what this underlying aspect of Dasein is for all humans, that deep-seated yearning for participation in authentic talk, which it's trying to avoid by having idle talk. So really what it's turning away from is what he seems to be hinting at what we should focus on.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. Um, so Heidegger, I think he doesn't really stress that um as much as he should, in my opinion at least. He doesn't. I think he will get into that some with anxiety and the uncanny. But it seems like for the most part he's saying that our natural tendency is this movement toward fallenness. So we have more of an urge to kind of run away from ourselves, or self in the Heideggerian sense at least, into this inauthentic mode. But there's also this kind of counter tendency, because the inauthentic mode is rather empty and unsatisfying, and you know no matter how much Heidegger, yes, he's not doing ethics, and he's saying these things aren't ontologically bad, quote unquote, and I like that. But the reason they sound bad for the most part, uh, I think that shows that there is also this um, desire, drive to follow some kind of counter tendency of that, which at least will be that'll be what anxiety and the uncanny kind of, they at least go in that direction, even though they're, the way he describes them is kind of ambivalent. I mean, it's kind of like a uh, H.P. Lovecraft. You've got terror, but you've also got fascination, and they kind of go hand in hand. This ambivalent aspect, that's the uncanny. So I think it's something kind of like that. But I don't know. Another thing that's kind of related to this is, so the way that these modes are described. So you can definitely see how it makes sense to say that, yeah, these aren't just universally bad, horrible things. They're necessary in a lot of ways. But I think it's the thing that we can sort of instinctively understand that is quote unquote bad about them would be if somebody was just completely restricted to them and had no drive to get outside of idle talk in order to talk in some other way. And I wonder, where does that come from? If the they self is, the public way of interpreting things and judging things, that also sets these normative perimeters for what we consider to be good and bad. But why is it that inauthenticity itself has this bad kind of vibe to it if we're under its spell? It's a very strange way of being. It's kind of, so Heidegger, I think this is connected to the way that Heidegger talks about, the more it has power over us, the more it tries to hide actually what it's doing, and the more it can't really reflect on itself in some kind of meaningful way. It can't actually it can't show itself in its being for what it is. Instead, it has to have idle about idle talk. It has to be just one more way of talking, kind of ambivalent. Well, maybe this, maybe not. But yeah, okay, I'm rambling by now, so I can stop.
Well, to
I
back
think my
you
internet's
up,
working too.
well, to back you up, Chase, a bit. I mean, in terms of him not taking a side, in terms of, I don't get the sense in this chapter, at least, he's attributing this strong kind of this, like, I guess, normative dimension to it, because he says at, like, this is in Heidegger 176, 3/4 of the way through. He says the ontological existential structure of falling prey would also be misunderstood if we wanted to attribute to it the meaning of a bad and deplorable ontic quality, which could perhaps be removed in the advanced stages of human culture. Like, at least at that section, I was reading him as sort of like just being like, like saying that, to be inauthentic is just, he's not trying to say here, at least, that the goal is to like remove inauthenticity altogether or something, but rather that he's, I mean, I'm still trying to get a grip on what he's saying, but I mean, it seems to be something like what you were just saying, Chase, about it's just a part of our structure as Dasein is this, like, this, I guess this, that we're always thrown into the world. And so as such, we have to, just to navigate the world, kind of, we have to comport ourselves in it in a kind of inauthentic manner or something.
Almost like a process, like a survival mechanism in a way. Like it's not a prescriptive thing where it's necessarily bad, but there's modes of inauthentic self that what is it we're turning away from in those moments? Like I have inauthentic conversations every day. It's just part of being human. But at the same time, why is it that I yearn for these authentic conversations?
I mean, I agree that he's trying to avoid being normative, but there to me seems to be a clear indication that he really thinks that, that there's something not good about just resting in fallenness and just that's it. That's all there is to your life is idle talk and fallenness. That would be there's something tragic about that. And I thought that one of the points of that passage that the kind of passage that Matthew read is that these modes of fallenness they're always already part of an aspect of Dasein, so they're inescapable. And I mean, not only are they inescapable, they're actually constitutive of what we are. We are that. Nevertheless, there's possibility of modifying them such that you gain something like authenticity, and there does seem to be a push and that would be a good thing if we could modify fallenness in such a way that it we could move toward something like authenticity. So I mean, it's maybe not exactly normative, but so, and I think, part of what I made some comments on Discord about the relationship between this and the Christian notion of fallenness. I think one difference is that that in the Christian notion of the fall, it's something human beings did, like Adam and Eve fucked up. So there was this great state of being in the Garden of Eden, and then they made a choice, and that choice fucked up the world for everybody from then on. And whereas I think, it's like Heidegger seems to think there is this kind of fallenness, but it's not, there wasn't ever any Eden. It's always been, I mean, this is just what it means to be us. There was no pre-fallen anything, and it wasn't due to any kind of choice that anybody made. It's just part of the structure. It's part of what it is to be Dasein, is to be in this state. And yet he seems to want us to aspire to modify that fallen state to move toward authenticity.
Yeah, to echo that, like on Heidegger 180, so towards the end of the whole section here, he goes, our existential ontological interpretation thus does not make any ontic statement about the, quote, corruption of human nature, not because the necessary evidence is lacking, but because its problematic is prior to any statement about corruption or incorruption, which I think is kind of getting at a similar thing to what you're saying, Nevitt, of like, this is just like a structural feature. It's not like it happens before. It's not even possible to say we've been corrupted or that we could get to a place that's not corrupt. It's like to use that language is already seeming to be making kind of a mistake by his account.
I wanted to talk a little bit about something that you were saying, Joseph, because you were talking about like this yearning for authenticity. And I kind of wonder if maybe we'll see more of this later, but I wonder if part of the motivation that Heidegger could give to why we have that desire for genuine speak is something that he says in Heidegger 171 in the curiosity section, where he's talking about this kind of Greek notion of man's essential being, I guess humanity's essential being. The line from the Macquarian Robertson translation, or the couple of lines that I think are interesting, are the care for seeing is essential to man's being. This remark, and then sorry, that's a translation, I guess, from something that Aristotle said. This remark introduces an investigation in which Aristotle seeks to uncover the source of all learned exploration of entities and their being by deriving it from that species of Dasein's being which we have just mentioned. This Greek interpretation of the existential genesis of science is not accidental. It brings to explicit understanding what has already been sketched out beforehand in the principle of Parmenides. And then there's another quote in Greek. Being is that which shows itself in the pure perception which belongs to beholding, and only by seeing does being get discovered. Primordial and genuine truth lies in pure beholding. That, in conjunction with his discussion about curiosity, kind of makes me think that part of or one of Dasein's innate drives is to come into contact with reality, and so that is what I'd be curious to know if he says more about this later, but that could be a possible explanation for why there's a desire to avoid idle talk.
And to build on what you said, particularly for discourse, like when we have idle talk, we know there's something in it that's lacking. You can call it whatever we will, without being prescriptive or putting a normative association with it. But we know at its core, something there is lacking. So we're turning towards it and we're looking for another mode of being or language that leads to what I think he would call discourse.
I disagreed in the comments, but I haven't seen or had gotten the sense that like anything about everydayness, idle chatter propels us into pursuing authenticity. At least at this point, I have not gotten that sense. I think we could speak to our experiences. I think like when I look at my experience, that rings true. But I haven't seen Heidegger say anything about this kind of like experience of lack within everydayness. If anything, I'm seeing him like, what are those qualities that he describes at the end of the chapter? We've got temptation, tranquilizing, entanglement, like alienation, right? That's kind of negative, but I think it's experienced as tempting, tranquil, and this sense of like entanglement. Like, what is the phrases that he uses with entanglement, trying to find those? This exaggerated self-dissection, tempting itself with all possibilities of explanations. It's almost like it has this like, I don't know if we want to say like inauthentic self-knowledge, right? I think of like self-knowledge when it says like characterologies or typologies, like I'm not really sure, but it makes me think of like all the different personality tests. I mean, he's using the word factically, maybe I'm jumping, but it's like this kind of factic or ontic understanding of self that we kind of just throw ourselves into. I think about the like kind of like the trap of self-development. I do that at work. I'm a wellness person. Like I talk about just all these ways you can measure yourself. But I get the sense that like it can be really alluring for us to throw ourselves into the they.
Yeah. I think his main he wants to establish that urge in that direction in towards fallenness that is fallenness. And then I think within the modes of fallenness, I don't think that's exactly the correct technical way to talk about that, but we're in average understanding of idle chatter, so y'all know what I'm talking about. So within those modes of fallenness that he's discussed, I don't think basically, Joe, when you said I think you're right that he hasn't within those he hasn't shown any kind of urge or that desire that we all are probably more or less kind of mode of idle chatter that I'm reflectively using right there. Everybody knows that they've got this thing in their experience of this desire for something more than simple, empty, idle talk and inauthenticity. But it doesn't seem to come from any of those modes that he's talked about. So I think one way to think of it is that it doesn't come from inside inauthenticity so much through a kind of dialectic sublimation or sublation of itself into some dialectic, something new dialectically. Instead, it's something that comes from outside of inauthenticity. So inauthenticity, the way he and the whole kind of the public world that's constituted by it, it doesn't want to have, it will not acknowledge that there's anything outside of that. It knows everything already. It doesn't need what outside. It has no idea what that is. So I think the way that desire comes from, it's something from outside of that, that's completely outside of those parameters of interpretation that the public gives us. And because of that, it's also quite difficult to indicate. But I think that's why he's also has to, well, what he's using to indicate what those are end up being things such as anxiety, the uncanny, things of that nature, reticence, forms of keeping silent. So, or even something like poetic speech that can maybe disrupt the kind of linear propositional way of thinking. I think something like that at least gets to where that source of the desire for authenticity could come from. And I think he'll eventually, the thing that I talked about is the call of conscience. That will be something kind of like that, because so the caller is Dasein as well, and it's Dasein calling Dasein back to its authentic possibilities. So I think that is something like the phenomena that we're talking about.
That's how I interpreted it. Yes. But then again, to be fair, I'm also interpreting this from reading ahead in the text, not just this section. So that is my fault. I'm sorry.
Well, and also I wonder, I mean, Chase, at certain points you were kind of breaking up, but I thought you were saying maybe that like the authenticity has to come from outside the realm of the kind of fallen, and maybe you mean the same thing, but here he says, so this is at like 179, Heidegger 179, maybe like two paragraphs in, the end of that paragraph. He goes, Dasein can fall prey only because it is concerned with understanding, attuned being in the world. So that sentence kind of speaks to, I think, part of what Joseph was saying earlier. It's like we know the inauthentic seems to be, the fact that it's inauthentic. It's like we're yearning, or there's an implied authenticity that we're at least deprived of or something. Anyway, Dasein can fall prey only because it is concerned with understanding, attuned being in the world. On the other hand, authentic existence is nothing which hovers over entangled everydayness, but is existentially only a modified grasp of everydayness. So with that sentence, it seems like he's saying like authentic existence isn't something that comes from like, breaking out of entangled everydayness, but it's modifying your grasp of everydayness, whatever that means. I mean, it seems that might imply that there's a way you could be engaging in what looks like idle chatter, but in a way that it almost seems similar to like the Christian notion of like being in the world but not of it kind of thing. Like you might have to comport yourself with the they and all this, but you're relating to that in a different manner that's not taking it all for granted in the way he's talking about. I don't know if I'm making any sense here. No, I thought that sentence was interesting, at least from him.
Yeah, that was helpful for me at least.
No,
Yeah,
it
I
was
think
from you.
so one way of, this is difficult to describe, and I think using the term outside is probably, you have to at least include a lot of warnings to go along with that, because that word can easily be misinterpreted, because he makes it pretty clear that this is so it's still something that's not necessarily transcendent, and it is indeed working within the same world, because it is the world, really. That's what authenticity is about. We're not, it's never taking up an individual and plucking them out of the world. Instead, it's kind of its inauthenticity is sort of absorbed in a certain level of magnification of the particulars within the world in a current state. Then authenticity would be something more like showing the whole structure of being in the world to you, which is how he describes anxiety in a lot of ways, is that there's no particular assignment or reference or signification that interests you any longer. No one single interpretation of the public that matters. Those things fade away, and what you're left with is ontically nothing, or no thingness. And what that shows is actually the whole world, not in the in ontic sense. You don't fly through the whole world and see everything, but it shows the whole structure of the world. So I think that's one way to think about it, that there's indeed some kind of a disruption of the normal order of inauthenticity and all the totality of significance that comes along with it. But because of that, you have to, the only way you can really access something, quote unquote, outside of it is through these kind of unusual modes of access, like the uncanny experiences of anxiety, which is nothing to do with psychological anxiety. It's more, well, angst is the word. Yeah, I don't know. I'll leave that there.
And what's interesting too is when he at least talks about the inauthentic self, it's like what everyone is saying, what James and Matthew and Chase is saying, is like he's talking about the functionality. He's not prescribing like religious guilt onto it. There's no aspect of this is necessarily bad. It's just part of who we are and what we do.
I was going to respond to something James said earlier, which I don't know, after the ensuing conversation, maybe this is off base, but when James was looking at the comment about Aristotle at the top of Heidegger 171, that I don't know, I'm wondering if maybe James is onto something. Maybe this is too much of a meta question about what Heidegger's up to, but that maybe Dasein has an inherent, I'm not sure what the word would be, desire, urge, or something, to have an immediate direct encounter with the real in some sense. And you see this in the history of, or you could interpret the history of philosophy and religion in those terms, as an effort to have an unmediated encounter with the real. And then you've got these different ways of trying to do that, these different explanations of what the immediate real actually is. Like in that part that James read, he talks about, well, in Aristotle, it ends up looking like this pure intuition. And, so then you've got this whole philosophical trend, or this whole philosophical movement that's about, well, that's what's really the real, is this sort of immediate pure intuition. which I think he is not endorsing, but that's kind of the one way this showed up, and then it shows up in different ways. And what I'm wondering is if I couldn't find the passage, that one of the difficulties is fallenness appropriates that idea in, because I think he was saying something about idle talk, and it's like idle talk somehow explains what is real to us, and then he's got it in quotation marks, and so yeah, so maybe the actual real is the uncanny or the strange, but what idle talk does is idle talk talks about the real, and it's this sort of, again, sort of trivial, superficial public world. And so it's like this mode of idle talk sort of satisfies that urge in a way, but it satisfies it in this inauthentic mode. But then once we figured that out, we're like, oh, I get it. I understand what reality is. Here we are. It's the real. Everything's great. I understand it. And then there's no more to do. There's no more work to do. You got it figured out. And so we're kind of done. But anyway, yeah, I'm wondering if maybe James is onto something there. There's this, I don't know again what to say, but that Dasein wants to have this encounter with immediate reality, but then the public world gives us a way to satisfy that, such that it blocks off further inquiry. Because once you've got the answer, you don't need to do any more investigation. Here's the answer.
Yeah, to jump off that, I mean, partly I'm drawing from stuff I've read about like later Heidegger, but I know like later Heidegger has, at least, I don't know it super well, but I know like, low resolution image of it is like that we have this kind of unfolding evolution of being in Western philosophy, with like Plato's The Good or whatever, and all things are intelligible in relation to this, the highest form or whatever, and then that kind of mutates into God, and then blah blah. Then we get into modernity. But the reason I'm bringing that up is to say, for Heidegger, I mean, I don't know if it is necessarily, if the issue is that we have this yearning to touch the real. Maybe that's part of it, but I know that it's definitely the case that for Heidegger, he thinks like whatever our background kind of conceptions of being are is going to kind of prefigure like downstream renderings that we are engaged in, like as Dasein moving in the world. It's like we're going to foreground different things dependent upon what our background metaphysics is, and he wants us to, he's deeply trying to get us out of the one we're in right now, which is, just assuming that, science and all the rest of it is like, getting us at the real, or that he wants us to have a deeper analysis than that, or more primordial. And so it seems from that kind of schema that idle chatter would be, part of that. Like when we're talking about anything, basically, we're taking for granted this baggage of pre-established, almost like grammar of ontology, that we're not calling into question, and we're just kind of taking everything that we're experiencing or discussing for granted, that it is the way we're talking about it, and that can become like a distraction or a superficial rendering of reality or something like this. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my and maybe I'm wrong. Someone could correct me if I'm getting that wrong.
I don't think it's right or wrong, but I think it's kind of on point with what his project is doing. Like there's an aspect to idle talk that leads you to think, well, we're turning away from something, that self-reflective aspect. And then also when it comes to like the metaphysics or the sciences, where we can somehow get to the like we're it's almost like it reminds me of that, like, you aspect of people who say like everybody who's erudite or well read just doesn't have a really good sense of wisdom or how the world works. Like there's an aspect to Dasein that can't be explained with scientism, that can't be explained with metaphysics, that even if you have all of these erudite studies, there is still something to be said about the participation and discourse that we have when we discuss our individual experiences of the world. So it's like he's bridging the erudite aspect of philosophy with the everydayness of being. So that's what came to mind when you were talking. Like there's a component of philosophy in everydayness, in fixing cars, and being any aspect of what it means to create, as much as there is a component of philosophy in studying ontology and phenomenology.
I don't think
So,
we've. Go ahead.
sorry, James. So I'll just say real quick that I think one thing that would maybe help with is to remember the terminology he uses of care and concern and solicitude and all that. I was just writing a comment, and I found myself going to talk about desire, and then realizing like, no, he doesn't use that word, but care is pretty much kind of the same thing, sort of. So I think if we think about it in terms of, Dasein's being is care and concern for the world, that's kind of the drive that's going on here, and it gets diverted back into this absorption in the public world in fallenness, but it's still the same thing. That's still the same desire ultimately. Sorry, desire, same care. The being of Dasein as what would propel also the call of conscience and authenticity and all that good stuff. So, yeah, hopefully that helps a little.
I was going to say that I don't know if we've talked much about ambiguity, and I kind of wanted to talk about that because when I read it, I wasn't quite sure what he was driving at, other than that, I guess, social conventions, beliefs, etc., things possessed by the they have a kind of relativism to them or something. That's all I took away from it. I don't know if people had other readings.
Yeah, the ambiguity was one that I wanted to ask about because, well, it was a little ambiguous. No, sorry. Thank you. No, but really, it was definitely more confusing than the other two, and so I think one of the main. So I reread it, and I still was confused, but it seemed like one of the main structures of it was a kind of, so ambivalence. It's kind of this indeterminacy between what he calls genuine, kind of grounded understanding of things, or I'm not sure exactly what, this way of genuine understanding, what is disclosed in a genuine understanding and what is not. So that's what the ambiguity and the indeterminacy is about. So I think actually a good example of this, or really a lot of these things, is social media. So you've got Twitter or something. You've got your feed.
X. X.
Oh, fuck that. I don't. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's actually a good example of the kind of I think that would be something like what that's idle, that's a little bit of idle chatter and curiosity as well. As like, oh, have you heard? It's now X. I mean, it's not a that's not like a insult against you, Joseph, or anything, but
No,
I mean
please.
we're all
Twitter
we're all
and X
speaking
as
in
much as you
idle
want.
chatter, whatnot.
Yeah.
But okay, so but Twitter, it's giving you just a bunch of these info blips or whatever. I mean, it doesn't have to be just Twitter, X, whatever. I mean, it's really media is the thing, but it just seems like it's all these things that he's pointing out. It seems like social media in particular has just taken those things and extracted the essence of them and ramped them up times 100. You got it's like an insane extraction of the essence of idle chatter and curiosity and ambiguity and whatnot. But yeah, so the ambiguity in this case would be I just see these info blips just scrolling through. There's no so I don't have an understanding just from seeing a headline if it's genuine understanding or not. And indeed, if I have to go figure that out, then I've taken that up as a project, and then I'm already outside of the parameters of the everydayness of the public that would be like, what the hell? What are you doing? No, that's weird. You don't actually look into things, you just read the headline. It doesn't nobody actually says that, but that's kind of what goes along with it. It's implicit. So I think that would be something like ambiguity. You don't really know what's genuine. You don't know what's not. It's just a bunch of info with a kind of superficial diversity to it. And you don't really know what's going on. And you're just along for the ride. So there's also this kind of this temporal aspect of it. And that was the part that I really was having trouble understanding, where he's talking about this thing of, is it having the scent of something? And it's kind of what does he talk about, like guessing or something like that? So I mean, it seems like he's giving an example of what's going on in terms of the future for this kind of inauthentic discourse, in that it's already decided about the things that are, so a lot of what this public interpretation is doing, it's talking about it's talking about Dasein's possibilities, and it's specifically limiting them, it's closing them off. So in order to talk about possibility, you have to think in terms of the future. And it seems like the ambiguity is also about that. I can't remember the terms that he's using, but yeah, being on the scent of something, but then once you already have once it turns into an actual project, then you're outside of it. I can't remember what the actual term.
Are you just talking about the part where he says, even supposing that what they have surmised and sent it out should someday be actually translated into deeds? Is that what you're talking about? Like the speech becoming action like that, or?
Yeah, kind of. That's involved with it. So that's the where you're going somewhat outside of this structure of ambiguity. That's where it turns into deeds or action or projects, where this ambiguity has to do with a kind of so it's kind of this we already know what's going on. We've already surmised and sent it out in advance what others have also surmised and sent it out. It's already determined those possibilities as a kind of blank possibility. And then the actual carrying it out into action is seen as secondary or derivative, or who cares? It's just about this abstract way of putting it in terms of, well, yeah, that's possible, of course. Yeah. Or it's not possible. Of course, it's impossible. So, okay, another way of maybe thinking about this is the way that somebody will, okay, say somebody has an idea of some occupation they want to have, some future, the big other of the law of the father, the dad in this example, be like, no, that's unrealistic. That's not possible. You can't make a living that way. It's a way of thinking already in terms of what is possible, what is impossible, and deciding ahead of time about that possibility. Then what actually gets accomplished is seen as like, oh, well, sure, it was always possible. So it doesn't have any way of talking about, well, what should I actually grasp all these possibilities?
Yeah, your max head grooming, Chase.
And turn it into a deed and turn to action and direction in my life. It's about kind of, well, what do I take up as my possibility and my, I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess I didn't hear what you said, Joseph.
Well, you were kind of breaking up earlier, Chase, but now you're clearer. But I'm going to jump in just briefly, a quote by him that's kind of on your wavelength. And also, I think your use of social media was like, that makes it make a lot more sense now. So this is Heidegger 174, like next to last paragraph. He says, the understanding of the sign in the they thus constantly goes astray in its projects with regard to the genuine possibilities of being. Dasein is always ambiguously there. That is, in the public disclosiveness of being with one another, and he goes on and on. But I think that, social media, Twitter and TikTok especially, are like really good examples of that. Like, you just jump on a trend, because there's another part where he goes, everyone keeps track of the other. Initially, first of all, watching how he will behave, and he will say and what he will say to something. Being with one another in the day is not at all a self-contained and different, but a tense, ambiguous, keeping track of each other.
Matthew, when you're turned away to the side, we can't hear you very well.
Well, okay, yeah, I've had that. So the point being, I'm just echoing. I think that using social media is a good example of Dasein constantly being embedded in these like trends, and like TikTok's a good example where you're kind of limiting your potentiality of being by jumping into whatever this latest viral trend is, and you're kind of agreeing to the parameter structure of TikTok as a platform, or Twitter. Like, you're kind of collapsing your possibilities of expression into the ones that have been pre-loaded for you to kind of express your like you can express your own self by taking this viral quiz that's on social media of like, what superhero are you from the Marvel universe or something. It's like these kind of predetermined alleyways. And there's another part that I was trying to find when I was reading just now in that section where Heidegger's saying that it's like whatever's the loudest voice will kind of just own the show for that moment, you know. So you can imagine just I don't know. I'm just saying I like Chase's choice of Twitter and social media as an example of this, like that they run amok in all these weird mutating fashions.
Well, I mean, Matthew, you raised some interesting questions concerning technology. Uh,
I honestly don't know if this is a good example or not, but what the discussion reminds me of this well-known phenomena where we talk about problems like without ever doing anything. And so, there's, like progressive America, we like to talk about people starving in other places and how awful that is. Or I don't know, there's just a whole and or like with political issues and so on, that speaking outrage is enough, right? That's enough of an action. So I just expressed my outrage, and I've taken all the action I need to take. And so I express myself in these various ways that are part of the public discourse of my tribe, and that expression is taken as if it was action, when actually nothing ever actually happens. We're just all bitching and griping and complaining, but we're satisfied that all of that is adequate. That we take that as if it was action. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good example or not.
Yeah, and to the ambiguity, maybe this is a stretch here, but I'm just going to continue using the social media example to get at it. But like when you think of some of these kind of culture war, somewhat engineered debates that unfold on Twitter or these other spheres, it'll be like, all these think pieces going back and forth about whether this person was racist or whatever, something like this. Choose your example, but it's like it's ambiguous. And it's like it's up for debate. It's like and that being up for debate is part of its function as a like they thing. I'm trying to use Heideggerian notions, but like because it's public, it's inherently ambiguous, and it's now like a war to join the tribe on how you're going to interpret whatever this phenomenon is. Are you going to be, the Ben Shapiro, or are you going to be like the SJW? It's like these wars that are like not authentic, at least from this Heideggerian lens. They're like pre-established, and then there's like entire apparatuses that are built to like take you in and get you to subscribe to that podcast or whatever. So again, I like Chase's notion of relating this to social media.
I think that's a really good example of how the ambiguity is connected with the idle talk, and that so he makes that point about the ambiguity of it, and also for curiosity, the superficial nature of what is seen goes along with idle chatter as just talking about it in a superficial way as well. So curiosity is a superficial way of seeing. Idle talk is a superficial way of talking about it, and then ambiguity is a superficial way of kind of trying to understand it, or taking it on as seeing how it actually relates to your life, something like that. But I think that's something that I've been thinking about is, okay, so I'm going to give an example. In soccer or football, whatnot, so you've got VAR, video assistant referee, that's supposed to clear up the ambiguity of these refereeing decisions, but it turns out to just kind of accelerate them and turn them into events in which everyone can give their stupid opinion about, and it's all extremely superficial, and that people usually reduce things to like one sentence, and it'll be based off some kind of stereotype of the projected image of a team or a player or something like that. And this is just rampant. That's how you do content creation, is something like this. It's kind of like these gearing in these relations of stereotypes together with each other to generate more content out of the ambiguity of bullshit, because the ambiguity about it urges people to give their own stupid opinion about it. And then the stupid opinions about something urge these counter opinions, and that's just how the Ouroboros works. It consumes itself in that way. But that's social media, and that's also a question concerning technology.
We haven't talked about falling prey this last section.
There is no way we're going to make Fallen Prey in 8 minutes. So if we want to try to do that, it's up to y'all. I certainly would like to discuss more of it, although I do have to leave shortly. Maybe we can start the next session on that as well. But yeah, I'll have to go. But please don't let that stop you from having the discussion. I just think it's interesting too, like how Heidegger, he never seems to offer an aspect of moralizing, but he seems to be having this like profound insight into the human condition to create a structure of what it is when we try to avoid the question of our being. And I really, really want to delve into that a little bit more in Fallenness as well. It's up to y'all. We can try, but that might be a long conversation.
Well, so in the next section, it will still cover fallenness, because that's kind of what he's contrasting. Or so he'll talk about anxiety and the care structure that it reveals, and he'll do that in terms of this kind of counter movement from fallenness. So we'll still, I think, be talking about fallingness at least next week.
I mean, really quickly, I feel like the four things was him just capturing fallenness as like represented by idle talk, curiosity, ambiguity. And then I saw him just giving those 4 or 5 like phenomenal parts of it, right? So we have temptation, tranquilizing, alienating, entangling, and turbulent. And so I feel like that was just kind of just like describing like this is how it's experienced. This is almost like the pull of it, which I guess speaks to that element of like this is why we could consider it to be like fallenness, because it does seem to have like this pull between those like 4 or 5 qualities that start Heidegger 177 and go till the end.
I've got the Stamball. I'm curious what the other translation uses for what Stamball calls the plunge. This is at the
Absturs.
He says what?
The German word absturs, but downward plunge.
Yeah, that word.
So I see it downward plunge.
Oh, that downward plunge. Okay. I thought what was one thing that was interesting was that he says this is a kind of movement. So on the previous page, he says, what structure does the movement of falling prey show? And then that's the movement, but he's got movement in quotes. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the quotes make me think of like the way he's used those quotes in the past, which is like a almost like a warning, but I'm reading it with sincerity, with earnestness of recognizing it as distinct from like a state or aspects or properties. But I think he's just I've been reading him right. Who knows, maybe he'll get into why he's using it that way. But in the
Yeah.
secondary text I read as well, they emphasize that he wants to consider it to be like a way of being like existential, as opposed to like properties.
Yeah, I might
Assuming
be.
it's supposed to imply some sort of dynamism, but not temporal. And, so there's like some dynamic aspect here, but it's not like a literal temporal movement. But that's the only thing I could come up with.
Yeah, I might be reading into it too much, but like that section I sort of interpreted as being his way of almost saying, without saying, like, I want to give a secularized demonstration of like original sin or like fallenness. Like, but I want to like separate it from that. It's not that exactly, because there's not this original harmony. But and I think that's the Kierkegaard that's running through him. Like, because I do think he's taking on this Kierkegaardian conception of human being in the world, but he's trying to de-Christianize it or whatever. So he doesn't want to posit, there's this potential, there's this old harmony that we've broken away from that we need to get back to. He's trying to get out of that language. But maybe that's just my own speculation, or that's me not putting that on him, possibly.
That reminds me, I think it's the concept of anxiety. It's either that or the sickness and the death. But when Kierkegaard describes the fall, and is like Adam is faced with this choice. God says, don't eat from that tree, and the serpent says, if you eat from that tree, you'll be like God, and so why not? But the weird thing is that at least I mean, it's been a while since I read it, but the strange feature of that event is that initially Adam has no idea what it means to fall. He's got no idea at all. He doesn't even know what good and evil mean, right? I mean, he literally has no concept of good and evil at all. And so he makes this choice, and it's only after he makes the choice that he's like, oh my God. And there's this, I mean, it's the way that Kierkegaard describes it, there's this sense of vertigo, the sense of vertigo of having, not even realizing he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and then having fallen off the cliff and only realized he fell after the fact. And then he's like looking back at the cliff edge as he's falling. Now he realized what happened. And so that, that maybe the plunge is like, like Matthew was saying, kind of a secularized version of that. There wasn't, at least in the traditional Christian story, there's literally this event, a person makes a choice, and there's the fall. Whereas, as Heidegger's already explained in detail, there wasn't any pre-fallen state. But nevertheless, there's kind of this anxiety associated with having already been fallen, in a way, this plunge, like that plunge off the cliff. But that's again, there wasn't ever a time when we weren't doing that. We've always been in this kind of state of free fall.
That's a really good way to put it. All right, I'm gonna have to back out, y'all. We did it. We made it till 9. We did it. We did it. Send it in 7 minutes. Yes. Yes. Sublation.
I'm trying to make the hearts appear. It's not working anymore. I used to be able to
Zoom is really
Oh, there we
fickle
go.
about it. There we go. Yes. Okay. And then
Hey!
sometimes you do the total
Supposed
thumbs
to be
up
able to
with
do
the
this too,
fireworks.
but
Yeah,
it's not working.
it's not doing it.
I think it's an Apple thing. No, now it's not working. Oh, there we go.
There
Okay.
we go. You did it. You did it. Fuck yeah. All right. All right. I really appreciate you all. Thank you. This has been helpful in forming ideas. Goodbye.
Hi, Joseph.
Yeah, I'm gonna hit the hay as well, but I'll see y'all next week. Later.
This is a good section.
Later.
See y'all.
So anybody else have any? Oh, look, there it is.
I'm gonna hop off too.
Okay, so I guess we're done. Okay. Adios.
Guess
hasta
so.
vista. Go ahead. You gonna say something, Chase?
Say what?
Were you trying to say something?
Oh, no, I was the same. Bye.
Okay. Hasta la vista, baby.
Adios.